Welcome back, everybody, for another discussion of economic globalization and social studies with Mr. Regas. Now, we spent a few days talking about our kind of fundamental economic concepts, things like microeconomics, macroeconomics, supply and demand, capitalism, communism. We're now going to be looking at kind of how the world became the way it is. So, what sort of things led to the economic globalization we see today? Our first main event we're going to look at. This is called the Bretton Woods Agreement. The year is 1944, 10 months before Germany surrenders in World War II, 15 months before Japan surrenders. Countries are worried about rebuilding after World War II. Now let's talk a little bit about the years before that. 1914. Most of the world has been colonized by European countries. This and some other things end up causing World War I. This was the most destructive war in human history. World War I is brutal. One of the things that comes out of it is a lot of these European economies are trashed. Some countries are like literally destroyed, so places like France, but they've all spent a lot of money fighting. They've lost a lot of lives, so they had to rebuild. Now, the 20s, we see a lot of things happening. Germany had to pay France what we call reparations. They don't pay sometimes. They take out money to do this. So the United States gives them money. The 20s are pretty good, but then the stock market crashes in 1929. This leads into the Great Depression. So the Great Depression basically lasts all of the 1930s until World War II starts. World War II, though, is even more destructive than World War I. Up to 75 million people are killed in World War II. So these leaders meet, it was 44 countries, they met at the Bretton Woods, which is in New Hampshire, and they were trying to decide what the world should look like after World War II. And one of the things they decided was we need to have a cooperative global economy. So they created some organizations to help with this. Three of these are the World Bank, the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. So how does Bretton Woods contribute to globalization? Well, it creates laws and organizations, and it says how the world should interact. The whole purpose here was to try to stabilize the world economy. I won't get into too many details here, but we have a couple very important people in the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. These are two economists whose ideas basically lay the foundations for what we are still experiencing today. Now, John Maynard Keynes, and there's a link to a video about him if you click on his name on the slides, he was the architect of the Bretton Woods Agreement. What he essentially believed was that the government needed to get involved in the economy during recessions and depressions. So he thought that the government getting involved was a good thing. Now, I want you to think about today. We're going through the coronavirus pandemic. It's also an economic recession. Now, it's caused because of an economic shutdown, but what we're seeing is the government is giving people money, right? If you're unemployed, you lose your job, the government is giving you money every month. These are elements of what Keynes argued for, because the argument was that if we don't have money going into an economy to help stimulate it, recessions are going to be long and very destructive. Now, Friedrich Hayek, he believed in something called classical liberalism. So he disagreed with Keynes. He thought that the government had no role in the market. He said individual freedom was the best thing for the market and an economy. And so these beliefs become very important in the 70s and 80s and 90s. The two of them, they disagree, but both of their economic theories that they promote are very influential from the end of World War II even to today. I'll let you watch this video and the slides. Now let's talk a little bit about the World Bank and the IMF, because these are extremely important organizations when we look at globalization. A little bit first about the World Bank and the IMF and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. These are what we call intergovernmental organizations because it is countries, like their governments are the ones who are members. So these aren't private individuals that are in this organization, it's countries. The World Bank, formed in 1945, the purpose of it was to give loans to member countries. After World War II, the World Bank was supposed to help these European countries that were destroyed. They were supposed to help them rebuild. Now, with the World Bank, if you want to get a loan from them, countries must meet criteria. So here's three of the things that you must do to get a loan. You have to reduce government debt. So that means the government couldn't be spending more than it's making. You had to decrease corruption, and you had to want free trade. So free trade is trade without things like tariffs or barriers. You think back to our systems of like mercantilism, tariffs are used to try to encourage people to buy things made in your own country. Free trade is supposed to get rid of these sort of things. Any barrier to trade needs to be destroyed. Now, how does it contribute to globalization? Well, countries that are looking for aid, they go to the World Bank. And so there's a dependency on others. And it's an agency of the United Nations, and it's represented by a bunch of countries. Those countries put the money into it. And so if you're a country that needs money, you can go to the World Bank and ask for it. But they'll tell you, well, you have to do these certain things first. So it's got strings attached. Now, the IMF, also formed in 1945, and it works quite closely with the World Bank. The purpose of the IMF is to expand trade. It also, one of their main things is to monitor exchange rates. Now, any of you that have ever traveled to another country, you would be familiar with the fact that other countries don't use the Canadian dollar. What a crazy idea, right? If you go to the United States, our $2 are worth different amounts. So these are called the exchange rates. Now, a little bit about that. After the Bretton Woods conference, John Maynard Keynes, he argued that, or we actually did this, so it's not just that he argued, the countries of the world adopted something called the gold standard. So every country would have a bunch of gold, right? It might have been stored in places like New York, but you had like a vault with your name on it. If you've seen Die Hard 3, you would know what I'm talking about. So go watch Die Hard 3. Essentially, though, the amount of gold that you had, you could only print as much money as that. So if you had $20 billion worth of gold, you could only print $20 billion worth of paper money. This was to help keep exchange rates from going all over the place. In the 70s, the United States went away from this, and they saw something called floating exchange rates come into place. Floating exchange rates, all it means is that the amount of money that your dollar is worth, not everyone calls it a dollar, but I'll say dollar. The amount of money that your dollar is worth is based off of supply and demand. So how much do people want it and how much has been printed? The IMF also gives short-term assistance. We're seeing this currently in the coronavirus pandemic. The IMF is giving billions and billions of dollars to countries to help ease the suffering of the economic shutdown. So IMF, similar as World Bank, they help countries that are in need, and it creates a dependency on others. Now, the World Bank and the IMF are not charities. So they don't just give countries money as a gift. These loans have interest, so you have to pay them back and you pay back more. In order to get these loans, you also have to adopt free market policies. So there's a lot of supporters and a lot of critics of these organizations. People who support them say that in the long run, less developed nations will benefit from free trade. Critics believe that these organizations should not interfere, that the loans should be given without any strings. Now, one thing I'll say quickly, and we'll look more into this throughout this unit, with the opening up of markets in the past 50, 60 years, so more and more free trade, this has resulted in billions of people moving out of poverty and increasing their standard of living. So there is an extremely strong argument for that free trade element. However, it's not perfect. Here's a comparison between the World Bank and the IMF. World Bank, their original goal was to help rebuild war-ravaged countries. And so their current goals: increase growth, reduce poverty in developing nations, do things like fund specific infrastructure project. The IMF, they started to monitor exchange rates, promote economic stability. Currently, they provide emergency short-term loans. They demand reforms in a country to promote good governance and get rid of corruption. Both of these are headquartered in Washington, D.C. Both have grown, and they both are under the control of the United Nations. So supporters. Well, they say money for the IMF is provided by all member countries. So it's like a pool. You pay into it, and then when you need it, it's there to help you. Helps build economic stability, and this is critical for democracy, and must have majority of votes to adopt decisions. Now, people who are critical of the World Bank and the IMF, some of the things they say are that the United States and other powerful nations control it. And so the interests of the United States and these other powerful countries are represented rather than the countries who actually need the help. There's also criticism that the IMF and World Bank support military dictators, or loans end up leading to hurting the citizens of the country, and that it does not promote democracy or human rights. There are supporters and critics of both, and this is something we see grow and grow. And so you have people who are, we could say, pro-globalization or anti-globalization. We'll look into this in more detail. Now we're going to do a really quick rundown of the second half of the 20th century. After World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States enter into something called the Cold War. This is essentially communism versus capitalism, USSR versus USA. Once it was over, most countries left that communism model. Now it's called Cold War because USA and USSR never actually fought each other. Some of the things that happened during the Cold War. Well, we have the Korean War. So starting just a few years after the end of World War II, we have communism in North Korea being supported by China and the Soviet Union versus the push for democracy in South Korea. Countries like the United States and Canada are fighting here. Now, to this day, it's just there hasn't been an official end to the war in North and South Korea yet. You also have the Vietnam War. Millions of soldiers and civilians died. This is the whole purpose here was trying to stop the spread of communism. So we see the anti-war movement spread in the United States. Now let's talk a little bit about Germany, because this is an interesting place where we kind of see the difference between communism and capitalism. And we really see this between East and West Berlin. So Berlin is a city in Germany. It's a pretty big city. After World War II, though, Germany was split up into East and West Germany. West Germany was under the influence of countries like the United States, England, France, while East Germany was under the influence of the Soviet Union. So we see communism and capitalism being the main economic systems in the two respective countries. Berlin was a city that fell in East Germany. However, even though it was a city in East Germany, it was split between West and East Germany. So there was West Berlin and East Berlin. West Berlin belonged to West Germany. So the people in West Berlin practiced capitalism. They had much more freedom, while in East Berlin, separated by the Berlin Wall, and you can see pictures of that here. This separation was that difference between capitalism and communism. There's stories where people would talk about they'd be living in East Berlin and they could see over the wall, and the housing in West Berlin was much nicer. You'd have new apartment buildings, billboards. It kind of looked very happy to them, while in East Berlin things were more drab. Eventually, at the end of the Cold War, one of the first things that happens is the Berlin Wall falls. So November 1989, the Berlin Wall falls and East and West Germany begin reuniting. So this happens in 1991, the official reuniting of West and East Germany into Germany. And this would be the end of the Cold War. So what are some of the contributions to globalization that we see? By 1989, globalization is in full force. Many countries move to capitalism, so we see countries opening up their borders. Countries are learning from each other, they're trading with each other, and you see many new technology. This is a big, powerful force for globalization. And that's a little bit about the Cold War. So essentially, what we see is from World War II, the world becomes more interconnected. With the end of the Cold War, this accelerates even further. The 1990s and then the 2000s are a period of fast economic growth for a lot of countries around the world. And we see this kind of embodied the most in countries like China and India. We'll talk about that more later, but that's a little bit about the foundations of our current economic globalization. Thanks for listening.